The Hidden Forces podcast features long-form conversations broken into 2 parts, the second hour of which is made available to our premium subscribers, along with transcripts and notes to each conversation. For more information about how to access the episode overtimes, transcripts, and rundowns, head over to patreon.com/Hidden Forces. You can also sign up to our mailing list at hiddenforces.io, follow us on Twitter at Hidden Forces Pod, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? My guest on this episode of Hidden Forces is 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, historian, and author Thomas Ricks. This is one of those rare instances where I got to speak with someone whose previous work had an important influence in shaping my own thinking during a time in my life where so much about the world and foreign affairs felt utterly new. The year was 2006, and Thomas Ricks had just published what I still consider to be the most authoritative book on the Iraq War and the disastrous mismanagement of the country's occupation. So when his publisher reached out to me to tell me that he was out with a new book on the founding generation and the influence of Greco-Roman thought and culture on the American Republic, I leapt at the opportunity. First Principles is both a timely book, timely because we too find ourselves today grappling with many of the questions, concerns, and anxieties that animated and vexed the drafters of the American Constitution, but also a deeply profound one, because it reminds us that America was, is, and always will be an experiment. The Constitution was constructed, after all, in the midst of the Enlightenment. What was most important and really new about the Age of Reason, writes the scholar William Getzman, was the sublime confidence of the intellectuals and societal leaders in the power of man's reason. Human nature, like all other nature, was a constant that yielded to rational inquiry. In other words, the Enlightenment showed the founding generation that it was possible to use reason and observation to discern the eternal laws of nature and then to use that understanding to aid human progress. To be enlightened was to have an energetic way of examining the world with skepticism and self-confidence, and that self-confidence came with the knowledge that the world was knowable, that truths could be discovered, and inquiries made into the nature of things. To be enlightened, as the intellectual historian Caroline Winterer put it, was to be filled with hope. It was with this sense of hope and empowerment that America's founding generation set about to construct the American Constitution. What were their objectives? Who did they look up to? What books did they read? And why the obsession with the ancients? What lessons did they take from the successes and failures of the Greeks and Romans? What did they value in themselves and in others? How did these values inform their construction of the Union? And what can we learn from their experience when grappling with our own challenges today, whether we're talking about executive power, media censorship, political division, or any of the other issues that animate the spirit of today's generations? The purpose of this episode is to provide a historical context for the challenges we face today in an effort to understand that they are not altogether new, nor are they insurmountable. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode with my guest, Thomas Ricks. Thomas Ricks, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you.
I am very excited to speak with you today. I'm not sure you know just how excited I am. I really enjoyed reading your book. I enjoyed it so much that I was actually disappointed when I finally finished it. And that's not something that happens to me very often. You really did an amazing job with this book.
Well, I quote a lot of great authors in the book, historians like Gordon Wood and Richard Brookhiser. There's a whole bunch of great books to read about this period.
There are. You know, there's this great book by Kevin Phillips on the American Revolution. Your politics kind of remind me of Kevin's. Are you familiar with him at all?
I am familiar with Kevin Phillips. I would say he's more libertarian, more to the right than me.
Okay.
But we agree, I think, fundamentally about the workings of democracy and the problems of America as it kind of sometimes drifts away from democracy towards oligarchy.
Well, he started off as a Republican, famously authored the emerging Republican majority in the late 60s, but became increasingly disillusioned with the party in his later life. And I actually read one of his previous books, American Theocracy, around the same time that I read your book, Fiasco. I think they both came out around the same time. And he also wrote a book about the American Revolution titled 1775, and I had him on my old TV program to talk about it. And there's a great chapter in the book devoted to covering inflation in the colonial period for anyone listening who might be interested in that. It's a fascinating read. So before we get into your latest book, First Principles, why don't you tell me a little bit about your background? When and how did your interest in history begin?
I think I've always been interested in history. I lived in Afghanistan for 2 years when I was a teenager, and that got me a lot into world history. And I married a historian. My wife wrote a very good book on the largest slave escape in American history, a book called Escape on the Pearl. And that frequently has been our dinner table conversation, to the point at which our daughter, when she was about 8 years old, once threw her fork down at the dining room table and said, tobacco and slaves in the Civil War. That's all this family ever talks about. Sure enough, she is now a historian in Baltimore.
You must be very proud of yourselves.
We raised a couple of really interesting kids. They're not always easy, but man, are they interesting.
So I read that you had you went to high school, or you went part of your high school in Kabul. What was that like, being a teenager in Afghanistan?
I loved it. It was 1969 to 1971. Kabul was really in a kind of golden period. It was quite peaceful. It was, in fact, sometimes a refuge for intellectuals from Pakistan and from Iran, a place where they could get together, and enjoy their own culture without a sense of repression. Benazir Bhutto, the former prime minister of Pakistan, now dead.
Assassinated.
Yeah, she once told me that when her father was prime minister, she used to come up to Kabul to party, and she was known as a party animal. I loved Afghanistan. I was 13, 14, 15. I was young enough to kind of be unobtrusive, not to be noticed, but old enough to learn the language and to travel around by myself sometimes. And I knocked all over the country. I skipped school a lot. The nearest English language bookstore was down in Pakistan, so I'd take the bus down there sometimes to buy piles of books. And I just had a dandy time. It was kind of sad. I went back to Afghanistan as a reporter after the Americans went in late 2001. And boy, did it feel different to me. The people had been through decades of war, and places that I remembered as verdant valleys with grapevines and so were just smashed, destroyed, burned, and minefields.
So you left right around the time of the Soviet invasion. Was it because of that?
No, we left. It was a few years before the Soviet invasion. I think the Soviets came in 76, if I recall.
So they were already in Afghanistan, you're saying, before the 79 coup?
Well, yeah, they're backing the regime there. It's funny, I haven't thought about Afghan history recently. They're supporting a regime and it's under fire. Yeah, and eventually the Soviets themselves invade Afghanistan and have a very tough time there. Afghans do like to fight. Guerrilla warfare is kind of the national sport there.
So I'm just curious, what did your parents do that led you to live in Afghanistan?
My father was a professor of psychology at Columbia University. And after the student uprising there, he was kind of disgusted with both the students and the administration. And so he put in for a Columbia slot overseas. Columbia had a contract to provide professors to universities overseas. So off we went to Afghanistan. And my father, who was a son of a Wyoming cowboy, he's from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, found Kabul very similar to Wyoming. He loved it, horse riding and skiing and stuff. We just knocked around and had a grand time there for a couple of years.
So for most of your career, you've written about military history, is that right?
Yes, I covered the U.S. military first for the Wall Street Journal and then for the Washington Post for a total of, I think, about 20 years. And I've always been interested in history. Covering the Pentagon for me was kind of an ideal beat. It was an important beat, but it was a great way of looking at 3 or 4 different kind of sandboxes. You could write about foreign policy. You could write about congressional politics. You could write about weapons technology. And most interestingly, you could write about real people doing real things. In most of Washington reporting, you're writing about policy, politicians, and you had that on the Pentagon beat, but you also had soldiers on patrol in Mogadishu who had nothing to do really with the world of Washington. And I found myself increasingly attracted to that. I decided that my job was to cover the story in the field. The analogy I used was, if you're a baseball reporter, you don't just write about the ownership of the baseball team, you write about the players. And I decided to focus on the players. And my books with Baking the Core began with that, about Marines and the training of Marines. And then Fiasco really is a book, in retrospect, about the battalion commanders of the first couple of years in Iraq. The reason is that they were the people at the level at which policy met action. The battalion commanders, that is, lieutenant colonels, were high up enough to know what the policy was supposed to be, but low enough to know what the reality on the ground really was. And they really were suffering. They were kind of the clutch plates where theory met practice. And as one battalion commander put it to me when I said this to him, he said, yeah, I'm the guy who has to go out and say, hey, guys, you just did 12 months. We're going to do another 4 months here. We're not going home.
Yeah, Fiasco is an amazing book. I do strongly recommend it to anyone that's not read it. But, the experience
Oddly enough, I think my new book is better written. I think Fiasco is a good work of reporting. On this book, I tried to focus more on writing than I had in the past, to be easy to read, to be concise, to really think about, instead of just trying to describe something with 2 or 3 words, sit and think, perhaps for half an hour, about, is there one good word that fits here? It was just kind of a challenge to myself, and I enjoyed it.
So let's talk about that. What was your inspiration in writing this book? The book's title, as I will have mentioned in the intro, is First Principles. But what possessed you to write it?
Well, I can tell you exactly. It's in the same building I'm sitting in now, my house in Maine on an island off the coast. On the morning after Donald Trump was elected, I woke up and I said to myself, I can't believe what just happened. I don't understand what just happened. I did not think Donald Trump would be elected. I don't think I have the same view of this country that he has. And I wonder what the people who voted for him think. And I've been taught in college that if you really are trying to get to the basis, the bottom of a problem, start with the fundamental questions. So I said, okay, what's the fundamental question? What's the fundamental way to understand American politics? Well, I went downstairs to my library and I took down Aristotle's Politics off the shelf and I began reading it rereading it in the context of the election of Donald Trump. And I noted, for example, Aristotle says that oligarchies are the least stable form of government. And I said, okay, we're kind of in an oligarchical situation here, perhaps a democracy with trappings of oligarchy or the reverse. So what does that tell me? And it led me to other Greek philosophy and history, and that in turn led me to some Romans. And then I got interested in how the revolutionary generation, the people who founded this country and designed it, how influenced they were by ancient Roman and Greek philosophy, history, and literature. Because I kept on seeing reference to it as I read the classics, in the introduction and the footnotes and so on. There clearly is a bridge between the ancient world and the thinking of the revolutionary generation and the documents they left to us, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so that led me on this 4-year journey of thinking and reading it and trying to understand their view of the world as they designed the country we live in now.
Do you feel like it brought you closer to the founding generation?
Yeah, very much so, in 2 different distinct ways. First, I felt like I was a tourist in this world where I didn't quite speak the language, and you had to learn the language. When they use a word, sometimes it doesn't mean what we mean when we use it, like the word virtue, which is crucial to them. It appears much more in their writings, their letters, their speeches, and diaries. The word virtue appears much more than, say, freedom or liberty. To them, virtue meant being public-minded, public-spirited, putting the public good before one's own selfish interest. And they tried to fight the revolution on the basis of virtue and found pretty quickly that it wasn't working. And so they emerged from the revolution thinking, well, how can we do this differently? Are there different approaches, but they were molded by the classical past. It was their common political vocabulary. To them, especially, the decline of the Roman Republic was the central political narrative in world history. This, how a republic fell and essentially became a monarchy with a takeover by a general, Julius Caesar. To them, this had the urgency of front-page news. Why? Because when they look around, there's not a whole lot of examples that they wanted to imitate. There had not been many republics in world history. Those that had existed tended not to have lasted long, and most of them were pretty small. The exception was the Roman Republic, and so they really focused on that and on the decline, seeking to imitate Rome without replicating its fall. And so characters like Cato, the statesman, frugal, prudent, reserved, wise, he becomes the model for a public man, especially for a guy like George Washington. Cicero, the orator and politician, becomes the model of how to speak in public. Much more important in those days than he is to us now. Julius Caesar becomes the example of what they don't want. They don't want a takeover by a general. And this is one reason that George Washington is so important to them, because he wins the revolution and then voluntarily gives up power. He becomes president under the Constitution at the end of the 1780s. And again, after 2 terms as president, voluntarily gives up power. So these ancient models are hugely important to them. And until you understand that, it's hard to understand their thinking, their concerns, their worries. Also, as they look at their new country, they say, well, the 2 things that brought down the Roman Republic were faction and corruption. By corruption, they mean basically luxury, excessive wealth, and money in politics. By faction, they mean what we would call partisanship or party politics. And to them, these are the 2 great things to avoid, especially to the older ones like Washington and Adams. And that explains, when you look at the world through those lenses, that explains why John Adams had such a horrible presidency. Political parties were growing up while he was president, and opposition was forming to him. And he hated it, but not just hated it. He thought it was a sign of faction, and that meant the fall of the Republic. And so he starts throwing newspaper editors in jail. I look back on that and I think this is crazy, this is terrible. But if you look at it through his lens of Roman history, he is trying to prevent faction. He is trying to ensure stability. Now, of course, it's also, while we're on Adams, at least relevant to say, he is our first 1-term president. He runs for re-election and is defeated. He's mortified by this. He's humiliated by it. It pains him deeply. Yet, he gives up power to the opposition for the first time in American history. There's a saying that you don't have a democracy when you elect a president. You have a democracy when a president turns over power to the people opposed to him. And that's what John Adams did in 1800, turning over power to Thomas Jefferson, who had been elected. Now, being cranky old John Adams, he did it ungracefully. He got in Thomas Jefferson's way by making a lot of last-minute appointments to the federal government, and he didn't attend the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. Instead, he got on the 4 a.m. coach to Baltimore and left. I have been discussing with friends whether Donald Trump will attend Joe Biden's inauguration in January. I don't think so, but it'll be interesting to see. Maybe it'll be Trump's last chance to thrust out his jutting chin and show how unhappy he is.
I'd be surprised if he did attend. So let's actually break this down a bit more, because you distinctly chose to focus on 4 different people in the book, all former presidents. And from what I understand, you hadn't even intended to include Madison in that list from the outset. So I'd love to understand what informed your choices and why you finally decided on Washington, Adams, Madison, and Jefferson.
One thing I've learned as a writer is to pay attention to your elders. And so as I was thinking about this book and reading history, I went down to Providence, Rhode Island, and went to lunch with Gordon Wood, one of the great historians of the Revolutionary era. I'd read, I think, all his books, a bunch of them. And I laid out for Professor Wood my thinking about this book. And he listened and he said, one difference. He said, drop Franklin, go with Madison. And he said, look, Franklin is really a different generation than all the people you're talking about. He's much earlier. By the time that you're focusing on, he's an old man and he really doesn't make much of a contribution. Madison, by contrast, he said, is crucially important to this era. And the more you know about him, the more you'll appreciate that. And that came absolutely true. There is a saying among historians of the early American history that the more you know about George Washington, the more you appreciate him. I think the same is true of James Madison. George Washington made us able to have a country by winning the Revolution. It is not at all clear that had another person been in charge of the American army, that we would have won. James Madison plays a similar role after the Revolution. He comes along and says, okay, Washington's given us a country. What are we going to do? And Madison leads the way in designing a new country. The Articles of Confederation, the kind of artificial system they'd set up, a very weak central government, ran the country in the 1780s. Madison says that's not working. He sits down for 4 years and studies how Greek republics and confederations worked. He looks at the literature, and he emerges from that and says, we got to have a constitutional convention. He beats the drum for that convention. They finally get people together in Philadelphia. He's the first guy to show up. He gives the first big speech about, okay, here's how I think you could organize this new country of ours. And then he leads the fight for ratifying it after they've agreed upon a constitution. And then he helps implement it. In the 1790s, he and Jefferson basically develop political parties, develop an opposition. So again and again, Madison is in the middle of this. And actually, I agree with Professor Wood that after George Washington, Madison is the most important member of the founders.
So many different things to talk about here. Let's actually separate these two and discuss them each distinctly. Let's begin with Washington. What was it about Washington's character, his experience as a surveyor, and his temperament that made him such an effective general and leader of the rebellion, and perhaps perfectly suited for that time?
Washington is such an intriguing figure. He is not a verbal man as the other people I'm writing about in this book are. He is much more a man of deeds than of words. And indeed, he's not a particularly well-educated person. One of my favorite passages in the book is when John Adams, his vice president, is having drinks with Timothy Pickering one night in Philadelphia, Pickering, another member of the administration. And they get into an argument over whether George Washington is in fact illiterate. And Pickering says he is, and Adams says, no. When I was in Congress during the Revolution, we got very well-written letters from Washington. And Pickering laughs and says, no, those were written by that kid, Alexander Hamilton. But they all came to respect Washington. They found him not a brilliant thinker, but a man of sound judgment who thought and considered. And I would say what they were struggling with was he was a man who was uneducated, which made him kind of a puzzle to them. A public man was expected to be able to read Greek and Latin, and Washington didn't even read a single foreign language, French or Spanish. He didn't read much at all, in fact. But they were constantly surprised that he learned from experience. And I think this is typical of people who have a native intelligence but are kind of outsiders who don't have a great education. They can learn much more than other people from experience. They learn how to reflect on what happens to them and what they see around them, and they learn to act on it. And it's something you notice about Washington. He's learning all his life, especially in the crucial period as a general during the Revolution. He comes in a fairly conventional military thinker, really trying to imitate the British officer of the day. And he wants to conduct conventional offensive operations, in fact, fairly complex offensive operations like combined amphibious and land attack on Boston, which was foolish. He really did not have troops who were capable of carrying out such complex operations. And he then gets himself tied up in New York, which is because it's Long Island and Manhattan Island, again, entail complex amphibious operations. He simply doesn't have the people to do it. He gets mad at them, but he really is mad at himself. He knows he's not doing well. And he begins learning. He begins adjusting. And he tries another way of warfare called a war of post, where you sit in a fortress and wait for the enemy to bring the battle to you. That doesn't work either. He gets his butt kicked out of Long Island. He gets his butt kicked across Manhattan. He gets chased across New Jersey. All the time, though, he's thinking and adjusting, and eventually he adjusts to a very unconventional form of warfare in which he maneuvers and skirmishes, but does not try to fight big battles with the enemy except on occasion.
He would just pick them apart at the edges and wear them down.
Wear them down, nibble on them, and use your own people to their own advantage. So, for example, he has all these militiamen. They're not trained and seasoned fighters. They're terrified when the redcoats do bayonet charges against them. But if you allow them to fight near their homes and fields, areas they know, if you allow them to go out and ambush British supply parties that are looking for cattle or food, they turn out to be pretty effective. And over the course of 6 months in New Jersey, after he gets kicked out of New York, they whittled down the British force to about half of what it had been 6 months earlier, with no big battles, just constant fighting. 2 soldiers one day, 3 the next day, 20 prisoners the next day, demoralize the enemy, cause desertions, all of this peck away at him. And Washington learns and eventually wins simply because if he doesn't give up, eventually the British will get tired of it and go home. And that's what happens. And again, Washington, late in life, he steps down from the presidency, 1796. He goes home. And in the couple of years left to him there, he starts reading about abolition. None of the other Southern founders seem particularly interested in this. The people we're talking about, Jefferson and Madison. But Washington is thinking, this slavery thing isn't working. What are we going to do about that?
Well, there's so much to talk about there, and I do want to discuss that, the issue of slavery, because you talk about it at length in the book. And I think there's actually one letter in particular that Madison sends his father while he's traveling away from Virginia about his slave Billy that I thought was the most illuminating and in some ways moving part of the book. But before we get there, I want to actually ask you another question about Washington, because in another part of the book, I think you say that if George Washington was Cato, Adams is Cicero. And Washington does seem to be the person for whom virtue seems to be the most important quality of any of the founders. I don't know if I have that right, but
I think you do.
Okay, so help me and our listeners understand what it meant to someone like George Washington to live virtuously, and by extension, what it meant to the rest of the founders, how important virtue was. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but I really want to dig into that.
Virtue meant to be public-minded, to put the public good before your own self. You get things, for example, I think Washington said, I don't want to be paid a salary while I'm president. And Congress said, no, you have to accept a salary. Otherwise, it may be a precedent that other people can't afford. And probably Washington himself couldn't afford it. It turned out to be rather expensive to be president. You're constantly having people into your quarters and having dinners and so on. For Washington, trying to be Cato is key, partly because of this play, Cato, which was his favorite play and was very popular in the 18th century. That is the Cato he knew. The Cato in that play, there's a couple of lines in the play that resonate with us even today. Nobody knows the play, but they know the lines. At one point, one character says that he regrets he has only one life to give to Rome. At another point, a character says, give me liberty or give me death, which Patrick Henry famously quotes in his first speech in Virginia that gets the revolutionary ball rolling down there. Cato is a rather remote and austere figure. The other character from the same era is Cicero, who's a livelier figure, a great speaker, a crafty politician who puts down a conspiracy against the city of Rome, led by a man named Catiline. And a Catiline was the worst thing you could call somebody in the America of the 18th century. John Adams sets out to be a Cicero. He wants to be the Cicero of America. And to an amazing degree, he succeeds. He succeeds, unfortunately, in both imitating Cicero's good aspects and his less attractive aspects. Cicero famously was a great patriot, really working hard for Rome, but also was extraordinarily vain, constantly looking for flattering comments, asking historians writing about him to make sure you make me look good. Anthony Trollope, better known as a novelist and a historian, wrote about Cicero that when he talked about his country, he did so often, so greatly. Unfortunately, he also talked about himself just about as much.
Was Adams Nixonian?
There is a Nixonian aspect to him, but I think he gets a little bit of a pass on it. He becomes president in the 1790s. It's a terribly difficult position. He's succeeding George Washington, the father of his country. Nobody ever called John Adams the father of anything. So he has to be president, figure out what that means if you're not George Washington. He's
tough act to follow for a man who was so insecure and so in need of approval.
Absolutely. And he's not going to ever get the approval levels that Washington saw, hailed by everybody. And like Cicero, he's enormously concerned with stability. And he's terrified by faction. Well, these are exactly not the characteristics you want of somebody who's a president succeeding George Washington. And so Adams as president cracks down on newspaper editors simply for criticizing him. He throws them in jail. He sees it as evidence of faction, and faction to him means treason. So he has a lousy presidency. The politics of the country become more and more volatile. And finally, he's thrown out after one term. He's very bitter about it the rest of his life. But to his credit, he does turn over the power to Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson comes in, and in his first inaugural address, probably the second most important thing he ever wrote, Thomas Jefferson says two things. Number one, he says, look, not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle. And the second thing he says is, I'm not going to shut down the opposition. If they're right, let people listen to them and they'll approve them. But I don't think they're correct in their views, and I think people will listen to them and ignore them. It was a statement of great power, and actually it succeeded quite well. Jefferson had a successful presidency in terms of popularity, but especially in terms of consolidating the country and leading an opposition party in the presidency.
So by saying that not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle, he was effectively saying not every opposition is a Catilinarian conspiracy.
Exactly. He's saying there's room for an opposition here. And that was kind of a novel thought. We all know the phrase now, the loyal opposition, but that didn't come into usage in England until about 1820. So the concept of a loyal opposition was a new thing. And they were still figuring out what it meant. They were still developing a political vocabulary for this new country. And it was a hard thing, and it led to a lot of tough fights.
So I actually want to bring us back to something you said a moment ago when you mentioned Joseph Addison's Cato, because there's this great passage in the book where you actually set this imaginary scene in late 18th century America during the Revolution that really captures the spirit of what you were describing earlier. And I want to read that passage now for listeners because I think it'll actually be helpful. If on a spring morning in May 1778, following that hard winter at Valley Forge, we could approach a soldier warming himself by a fire and ask him his opinion of the great Roman orator Cato, he probably would not find the inquiry odd. Rather, he might respond with great enthusiasm that he had in fact seen a play about Cato just the previous evening, when it was staged by some accounts in the camp's bakery. He might even have played a role in it. Joseph Addison's Cato was, after all, one of the most popular plays in pre-revolutionary America, and indeed the favorite dramatic work of the camp's commander, General George Washington. This was a time when live drama was one of the few forms of public art. Our soldier might even be able to quote from the play, maybe that striking line about choosing between liberty or death, or perhaps the passage in which a character regrets that he has only one life to give for his country. When I read that passage, it gives me a deep appreciation for just how removed that generation of Americans was from our own time.
It's funny you should pick that passage. I was just thinking as you read it aloud, that's the first thing I wrote in the whole book.
That's so interesting. So I have to ask you something else then, because one of my early questions as I was jotting down was, how important was it for you to put yourself in that period in order to write this book, to let your imagination run wild That must have really been a wonderful byproduct of writing a book like this.
Not only was it a byproduct, it was almost the goal. In 2016, I did not want to be in the 21st century anymore. And the 18th century seems such a better place to go and hide. And effectively, I spent 4 years in the 18th century. I live in a house that was built in 1812 during the time Madison was president. And the streets around, when I go shopping, the streets are named Dean and Washington and Hancock and Ellsworth and so on. They're named for this. And so it actually felt kind of comfortable for me. I wrote this passage because I was exploring this play that nobody's ever heard of these days, and how familiar people were with it then, what it meant to them. And it was a way of getting my mind into the mindset that this is a different country I'm writing about, a different world, and I need to get their perspective. One of the things that came to me slowly as I researched the book was not only were they influenced by Rome and Greece, they were influenced by a different Roman Greece. It's not the Roman Greece that we think about these days. For example, they put Rome well ahead of Greece. Greece is kind of these eccentric country in the background. Rome is the important thing to them. But even when they look at Greece, they prefer Sparta to Athens. Samuel Adams, or the cousin of John Adams, and Samuel Adams himself, a great revolutionary, says that he wants Boston to be a new Sparta. And they saw Athens as kind of this goofy, too democratic, eccentric place.
Eccentric it was. What was it that they liked so much about the Spartans?
They saw them as profoundly democratic, frugal.
Their laconic lifestyle was appealing?
Exactly. They saw a similarity there, and they tended to overlook certain other aspects. And I think probably also, and this is just a suspicion of mine, the fact that the Spartans practiced a form of slavery that might have been the closest example in the ancient world to American slavery, in that it was ethnically based. Most ancient slavery was not race-based, but the Spartans made slaves certain tribes in their area, and there was an ethnic difference there. That may have also appealed to them. But basically, they were much more focused on Rome than they were on anything about Greece, with the exception of Thomas Jefferson, who is the Greek among the Roman-loving founders, a guy who, unlike the others, read the Greek dramatists, who really don't come to prominence in world literature until the 19th century under the influence of German academics in the Romantic era. In fact, it amazed me, the playwright who was most popular among the revolutionary generation, the ancient playwright they read, was Terence, who's a comic Roman playwright that nobody reads. And in my research, I tried to read Terence, and frankly, I couldn't. I just found it dull, and I had too many other things to read that were interesting. But I immersed myself in their language. And I'm glad you noticed that. I spent so much time in Founders Online, this great website that has everything these people ever wrote in diaries, letters, speeches, books. And that's one reason I stuck with their spelling, to constantly remind me that these people thought differently, they spelled these words differently.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about Thomas Jefferson. We'll get back to Madison, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about Adams, though I suppose your opinion of Adams comes through. He's not the most sympathetic figure in the book.
Well, he interests me in that I think Adams has had an inflated reputation in recent years, partly because of the
Was
David
it because of Dave McCullough's book? I was going to say, yeah, and the HBO
series, and which Paul Giamatti presents him as kind of this cuddly teddy bear. He's not a cuddly teddy bear. He's very prickly. He's like an exaggerated version of Woody Allen. Jefferson is another very interesting figure who I think also has had an inflated reputation for many more years than Adams. There's a saying that among historians, the more you know about Washington, the more you admire him. I find the opposite with Jefferson. The more I know about Jefferson, the less I admire him. And I suspect this is because of all the revolutionary generation, he's the one who has the greatest discrepancy between his words and his actions. Mm. And by that, I mean, he talks a good game about slavery, especially when he's living in Paris, but he never does anything about it. He is a guy who dreams about liberty while living off the sweat of enslaved human beings. When he builds his dream house, he buries slavery underground. He doesn't want it seen. So even in his dining room, he invents a kind of dumbwaiter to bring up the food from downstairs so he can reach over and grab the plates that are brought up from the kitchen in the basement. And that's so he doesn't have to have a slave standing at the table. This is a very complex guy, I think very elusive. Trying to write about Jefferson, I found kind of like trying to wrestle with the giant Marshmallow Man in Ghostbusters.
That's an interesting analogy. Never quite thought of Jefferson as the cream puff Marshmallow Man. But what do you think that was about? Because all of the founders, Madison, also his family owned slaves, and I mentioned the letter that Madison wrote about Billy, which was, deeply hypocritical. What was it, though, about Jefferson that you found to be particularly so?
I would say that what is moving about that letter that Madison writes, yes, it's hypocritical, but he's writing it in recognition of his own hypocrisy. He's dealing with the reality, which is Billy has seen freedom here in Philadelphia. How can we send him back into slavery now that he's tasted it? And this is exactly what we've been fighting for. And at the same time, there's perhaps a secondary thought. We can't have Billy go back to the plantation and tell the other enslaved people about freedom.
That he's seen other people that look like him, but who are free men.
And he might carry that taste of freedom down, and that would be pretty disruptive.
Exactly. That was something that you said in the book, that taste of freedom. I mean, that to me, that thought was the one that felt the most diabolical, because it really recognized just how psychological, that's the psychological dimensions of the slavery in America is what I think was so particularly evil about it.
Well, there's a moment earlier when Madison is quite upset at the beginning of the Revolution when the British colonial governor of Virginia tries to enlist slaves to fight against the Revolution. And he just regards this as not cricket, as if like, how dare they involve the slaves in our struggle for freedom? There are basic contradictions that even a man as insightful as James Madison is not grasping there. And it's hard in a moment of warfare and revolution to do that. But Thomas Jefferson, of all these people, is the most adept at avoiding reality. And that continually bothered me, that Jefferson is so good at not dealing with what is in front of his eyes. This is a guy who who goes along with boys, age 10, 11, 12, being whipped for not producing enough nails in his little nail factory at Monticello. Yet
cutting off their toes, pulling out their teeth.
Well, Jefferson didn't do that, cutting off the toes. Other people did. It was a common practice with a runaway slave to cut off their toes to make it difficult for them to even walk, let alone run. Slavery was a system based on violence, threat of violence, and on torture. This is one reason I think we need to do away with the word plantation and instead use the word slave labor camp, the phrase slave labor camp, which is much more descriptive of what they actually were. So here you have Thomas Jefferson sitting atop a very pretty slave labor camp who writes the Declaration of Independence that states at its beginning that all people are entitled to the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal. What a vast contradiction. And I find it almost impossible to get my arms around. The fact is that this man wrote the single most important document in American history. It resonates with us today. It's an aspiration for us, even today, to see that all Americans are equal before the law. Yet the rest of this guy's history is kind of horrifying. He wasn't even that good as a public man. He was a lousy governor of Virginia. He didn't deal well. He was the governor during the Revolution, and he didn't deal well in dealing with the British. He never, as I said, really addresses the problems of slavery, tries to do anything about it. There are a lot of problems with Jefferson. At the same time, this aspiration to live up to everybody being equal before the law is something we still fail at today. There are still Americans who don't believe that Black people are equal, are first-class citizens, or should be treated as such. And in fact, there are still American policemen who seem to have a hard time acting in the belief that black people are first-class citizens.
So one of the other things that I found really interesting about Jefferson, a fact that I did not know, was that although he was well-traveled in cosmopolitan circles and in Europe, in cities, he actually had never traveled west of the Shenandoah Valley.
It's an oddity of his. He lives within eyesight of the Blue Ridge Mountains, yet he never goes west of them. He sends Lewis and Clark west to explore. His father traveled all over the frontier, Western Virginia. And I think it's partly because of Jefferson's Epicurean beliefs. He defines himself as Epicurean, as somebody who...
Tell our audience who Epicurus was and what Epicureanism is.
Ancient Greek philosopher, a real contrast to the Roman Stoics. The Stoics influenced Jefferson's peers quite a lot, but Jefferson goes typically with the Greek. Epicurus, the philosopher of happiness, who said the goal in life is the pursuit of happiness, and the way to pursue happiness is to avoid pain and to be just and wise and prudent. But the avoidance of pain is key. And you see this in Jefferson a lot. Here he did know who he was. He was not a man who liked pain. He was not a man who liked entanglements. I think this is one reason that all his life he seemed to have a hobby of pursuing married women, because he could have romance without the prospect of having to wind up marrying the woman in question.
Had he ever had an affair with Abigail Adams, or was there ever any hint of that?
I think he had a crush on Abigail Adams, but look, we all do. I think she's a brilliant woman. She was the best thing about John Adams. I think John Adams went as far as he did because of Abigail Adams. Yeah, he pitches some woo at Abigail Adams.
Somewhat inappropriate, I suppose.
I don't think she ever had an affair with him, but he does get kind of soft and whispery in his letters to her. But she was too sensible a woman to get messed up with him, and she knew other women that Jefferson had pursued.
Well, his Epicureanism probably goes some way towards explaining that as well.
It does, because Epicureanism kind of leads to Romanticism. And Romanticism follows this very hyper-rational age of reason, the Enlightenment. And Romanticism is kind of a reaction. It says, no, let's privilege the heart over the head. And you start to see stirrings of that in Jefferson, especially in his romantic letters, where he says, look, I know this is not reasonable, but I have to go where my heart takes me. And his heart seemed to take him into the arms of beautiful married women.
Yeah, although it's interesting you say that, because the Romantics had a love affair with the frontier, which didn't seem to interest Jefferson all that much, but also because one would imagine that a Romantic would have seen that slavery was wrong, or he would have understood that dilemma. In many ways, it just seemed like a selfish choice, and a choice about comfort.
He was able to hold deep contradictions and live deep contradictions, and I think in some ways must have been made somewhat unhappy by them. He doesn't strike me in his later life, especially after his presidency, as a particularly happy person, whereas Madison does. Madison seems quite content after his presidency. He goes home, and you read letters from people who go and visit him. And one guy says in a letter, he visits Madison, I think, in around 1828 or so, and says he reminded me of Cicero, happy at his home. Of course, Cicero winds up killed a year later, whereas Madison had a happy after presidency and read and wrote and enjoyed himself.
There were aspects of Thomas Jefferson that reminded me of Walter Isaacson's depiction of Steve Jobs. His ability to ignore reality when it didn't suit him, or refuse responsibility for the moral consequences of his own choices.
That's an interesting comparison. I read that biography by Isaacson and was really intrigued by it. I agree with it. It had never occurred to me. Especially the two of them are so intrigued by design.
Architecture.
Yeah, design of various sorts. And also to facades, to having a different reality inside, and also to presentation. The Declaration of Independence is not just a great political document, it's a work of literature in a way that I think that Steve Jobs would say that some of his computers and telephones were works of art themselves.
Beautiful, beautiful. It was a beautiful document.
Yeah.
So let's switch now to Madison, go back to Madison. And this will actually bring us into a conversation about the universities and the education in colonial America. Because you actually spend some time in this. You discuss the role of Scottish educators, and you also discuss the role of the different universities and what made Madison so interesting, what set him apart, wasn't just that he was younger, but that he had more of a nationalist sense. And part of that was a result of the fact that he went to what was then called the College of New Jersey, now we call Princeton, which was sort of, as you described, the Berkeley of the day. Talk to me about what made Madison who he was so that we can, I think, come to appreciate the influence that he had on the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Madison's a funny figure because he is more important than he appears to be. And he plays such a crucial role in putting the Constitution together, really designing the house that we live in now. But you don't see it just looking at him. He's a little guy, 5'1" or 2", 110, 115 pounds. He doesn't have a good speaker's voice. And he suffers from some form of epilepsy. It's one reason he doesn't serve in the Revolution. He's not really a social person, which is unusual for a politician. He's single-minded in his devotion to politics. Jefferson loved many things: music, wine, women. Madison loved two things, just maps and politics.
Would you call him obsessed with those things?
I would. And this begins, I think, not only did Princeton make him a revolutionary, I think he went to Princeton because he sensed that that's where he needed to go. He did not go to William and Mary, which would have been the natural choice, the college that was in Virginia. Instead, he goes to him, what was north, to New Jersey, to Princeton. And Princeton is a fascinating place at the time. A lot of things come together there. Princeton, as you said, is like the Berkeley of the 1760s, what Berkeley was in the 1960s. It smoked with sedition, as one historian put it. It was full of revolutionary fervor. And in fact, King's College in New York, which later becomes Columbia, was founded in conservative reaction to Princeton. New Yorkers saying, we don't want to send our kids to that revolutionary school over in New Jersey. So they start their own.
I mean, if Hamilton had gone to university, would he have gone to Columbia?
Well, Hamilton actually tried to get into Princeton, typically in his sort of weird, brilliant, arrogant way, shows up and says, I need to be an advanced student, like skip a first couple of years. And they say no. And there's a reference to this in Hamilton as to whether he actually slugged an official of the college in response to being rejected. So Hamilton actually goes back to New York and enrolls at King's College, but then the revolution starts and the college is shut down and he goes off and eventually winds up being a staff writer for George Washington. And you really notice this. Hamilton is such a good writer. He's such energy and verve in his writing that his words leap out.
Do you think that Hamilton would have changed his views on monarchy if he had gone to the College of New Jersey?
I think he would have. And that takes us back to Princeton. The president of Princeton at the time is a Scottish minister named Witherspoon, John Witherspoon. Spelled Witherspoon, but I was in Scotland actually by accident last year. I learned Witherspoon, what we call Witherspoon, is pronounced Weatherspoon. So John Witherspoon stands out as unique in so many different ways. He's the only president of a college in America brought from overseas. He's brought from Scotland as an adult with his family. He's kind of a revolutionary figure, a radical figure. He is the only college president to be involved in politics at the time and the Declaration and so on. And he's the only clergyman to be involved. The rest are kind of withdrawn from it. But he has this Scottish fervor coming out of the Scottish Enlightenment, which is a whole subject by itself. And they're thinking seriously about public spirit, public life, virtue. We can actually read Witherspoon's lectures, and we know what he taught Madison. And for example, one of the things he talks about a lot is checks and balances, which Madison later makes a central part of the government he designs. And this comes out of Montesquieu, the French philosopher and designer of the modern liberal state. Montesquieu himself, very much thinking about Rome, writes a whole book about the decline of the Roman Republic, later writes The Spirit of Laws, a study in part of Roman laws. Montesquieu is the single foreign philosopher most influential on the Scottish Enlightenment. Out of the Scottish Enlightenment, you get a bunch of things. You get Witherspoon teaching at Princeton. You also get invention of whole new fields of thought, sociology, modern history writing, modern economics coming of Adam Smith, and even this guy, James Hutton, who through leaps of the imagination devises the field of geology. Also coming out of the Scottish Enlightenment is the Industrial Revolution, beginning with the invention of the steam engine, or an effective steam engine, by James Watt. So this is just changing enormously the world, and you really see this. A lot of Scottish emigres become involved in American politics. There's a heavy Scottish influence in the signers of the Declaration, and also in the tutors that come over from Scotland. Scotland was churning out well-educated young men who didn't have any money. In contrast to Oxford and Cambridge, which were too expensive for poor people to go to. And Scotland, because of its Presbyterian belief that everybody should be literate and be able to read their Bible, produces these young men who are hungry, intelligent, educated, and so they hop on the tobacco ships going back and forth from the Chesapeake to Scotland, and they go teach Americans. And Scottish tutors become the norm in large parts of America, but especially the South. So the people who tutored, many of these people, but especially Madison, were Scottish. And so you get this direct sort of flow, Montesquieu to the Scottish Enlightenment to the Virginia countryside, this thinking coming through, this very dynamic approach they didn't have at the time in England.
So I want to move the second part of our discussion into the overtime, Mr. Ricks. I want to focus next on the period during which time both the Articles of Confederation and later the Constitution were drafted, and try and understand what concerned the founders. What challenges were they grappling with, and what motivated their decisions in how they designed our system of government? I also want to tie it all back into the present moment and the challenges that we face in our own time, whether we're talking about gridlock or rising calls for censorship or money in politics. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener-supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of my conversation with Mr. Ricks, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to patreon.com/Hidden Forces. There's also a link in the summary page to this episode with instructions on how to connect the overtime feed to your phone so that you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Mr. Ricks, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation into the subscriber overtime. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.